Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Larry Rinder. I'm the Director and Chief Curator of the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here today for this wonderful colloquium on the art of Rosie Lee Tompkins. On a personal note, I just came from her church, where I was speaking with her congregation about her work. They were so excited to hear about the show, and I got a fill of Seventh-day Adventist music, and it inspired me, I think, to be a great moderator today. So this program, of course, needless to say, complements the current retrospective of Tompkins' work, co-curated by me and Elaine Yau, our Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow, with the assistance of Lucia Olabunmi Momo. This is the first of what I hope will be many exhibitions drawing on the phenomenal bequest from Eli Leon of 3,000 African-American quilts that came to us last year. And most of you in the audience probably know that Eli was one of the most passionate and voracious collectors of African-American quilts in the world. He lived in Oakland. He was a wonderful fellow and a scholar who collected really as part of his scholarly research and investigation into the connections between African-American quilt techniques and style and African models. So he, in addition to collecting quilts, he also collected Kuba textiles and bark cloth paintings from the Ituri forest, all of which now belong to BAMPFA. So this is an incredible treasure, and in addition to this exhibition, which I'm very excited to have as the inaugural show from this collection, we're in the beginning stages of working on another show that will take place in 2022, which will feature highlights from the collection, so something like a couple dozen different artists who are represented. The collection has over 400 individual artists' work represented from spanning a period from the early 20th century to the 21st century. Rosie Lee Tompkins is certainly the foremost among them. We have about 500 works by Rosie Lee Tompkins alone. This exhibition features 65 of them and is the largest exhibition of Tompkins' work to date. There have been a number of other shows, the first of which happened here, the first solo show back in 1997, a show that I organized back in 97. And on that occasion, I did have the great pleasure of meeting Tompkins at her home in Richmond a couple times, and she was a really wonderful, wonderful person. I'm very honored that today we have several members of her family here, and we'll be hearing a little later from her son, Sammy Howard. So to all of you in the family, thank you for coming from far and near, and we're excited to have you, so thank you. So before I introduce the presenters, Elaine Yau, Horace Ballard, and Lisa Gail Collins, I want to express my really heartfelt support for the sponsors of the exhibition. We had major support from Nyan McAvoy and Leslie Berriman and the estate of Eli Leon as well. Thanks also to Francis Bose, Anthony and Celeste Meyer, Margarita Gandia and Diana Campoamor, Topher Delaney, Faith and Steve Brown, Joyce and Mark Hulbert, and Myra Block for their support. So now I'll introduce the speakers in the order that they will talk, and then they can just come up in the proper order. Elaine Yau, as I mentioned, our Andrew Mellon Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow, is the co-curator of the exhibition and also the author of the lead essay in the catalog, which really, I think, breaks wonderful new ground in the study of her biography and its relationship to the quilts. And I presume we'll be hearing more about that in her talk. Her research interests lie in the area of art at the intersection of folk art and vernacular culture with the histories of modern art, as well as American material culture and visual culture. Her most recent essay, published in the Rutledge Companion to African American Art History, examines the shifting position of folk art in the history of African American art. And in addition to working with me on the Rosie Lee Tompkins retrospective, Elaine has curated or co-curated exhibitions here by the artist Frederick Hammersley and the photographer Dennis Feldman, and the current Art Wall project, which you can't have missed on your way in, the fantastic mural by Edie Fake. Next up, we'll have Horace Ballard, PhD, who is the Curator of American Art and Research Curator of Photography at the Williams College Museum of Art. I think you've come the farthest to be here, so thank you so much. He's also faculty in the Joint Graduate Program in the History of Art at the Clark Art Institute and Williams College. He's a scholar of the art and visual culture of Europe and the Americas from the 18th to 20th centuries, and he has previously held positions at Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, the Birmingham Museum of Art, the Museum of Art at the Rhode Island School of Design, and the Yale University Art Gallery. He writes and consults on the Black radical tradition and post-Black art practices, including for the Smithsonian, the Vera List Center of Art and Politics at the New School, and the Studio Museum of Harlem. He's currently preparing a book manuscript titled The Reconstruction of Beauty, Photography, Whiteness, and U.S. Masculinity, 1865 to 1900. Lisa Gail Collins is Chair of Art and Professor of Art History, Africana Studies, and American Studies at Vassar College, where she teaches interdisciplinary courses in American art, social, and cultural history with an emphasis on African American lives, among other areas. She's the author of The Art of History, African American Women Artists Engage the Past, Art by African American Artists, Selections from the 20th Century, and Arts, Artifacts, and American and African Americans, Context and Criticism. She's also co-editor with Margot Natalie Crawford of New Thoughts on the Black Arts Movement and co-author of African American Artists 1929 to 1945, Prints, Drawings, and Paintings in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then after those three presentations, as I mentioned, we'll be joined by Sammy Howard, who will offer some personal recollections of his mother. So, Elaine.
Well, thank you so much to each and every one of you for spending your Saturday afternoon with us. It's been a real honor to work on this show with Larry, to engage with the family, and a really, I think, exciting moment to reevaluate so much of this field. And so I look forward to the discussion and what the future holds in this. In the year 2000, quilt scholar and collector Eli Leon took what is perhaps the most telling portrait of the acclaimed artist Rosie Lee Tompkins. A lemon yellow jacket, a coral-hued shirt, and purple skirt draped gently across a chair's frame, and a pair of yellow shoes and orange tote bag complete the look. Tompkins named this trio of colors 3 sixes, signifying a group of relatives she frequently honored in quilts of this palette. When Leon learned the intriguing fact that Tompkins also sometimes wore this bold combination, he asked to photograph her. A shy and reserved personality, she was reluctant to have her picture taken, but instead she proposed that they use the clothes as a stand-in for herself, as an ingenious gesture of self-fashioning. Tompkins' desire for privacy, which was playful in this instance, became more adamant over the course of her quilt-making years, so much so that she accepted the name Rosie Lee Tompkins as a pseudonym for her given one, Effie Mae Howard. As Leon recalls, Howard preferred to avoid the limelight and generally resisted the exhibition of her work. Yet as he persisted in collecting her piece tops and enthusiastically showing her work over the last 2 decades of her life, the alias evolved to serve 2 purposes. Like the 3 sixes outfit, her pseudonym was a way of accepting a burgeoning artistic identity while offering cover and avoiding fear of more public exposure. So as both Eli's invention and Howard's concession sometime around 1987, the Rosie Lee Tompkins name took on a life of its own. Leon honored her wishes for privacy throughout her lifetime, mostly by omitting her photograph or sometimes her biography altogether in several early publications. And thus reviews of Tompkins's textile art have reflected a certain limitation in the information available about her. Nevertheless, critics have acknowledged the power of her jewel-like creations and restless compositions over the years, hailing her as one of contemporary art's greatest category-defying figures. And as BAMPFA has sought to illuminate new dimensions of her art in this retrospective, the artist's long-standing desire for privacy can sometimes make writing about her an uncomfortable prospect. Yet in telling and sharing aspects of her story today, I hope it becomes clear that my intent is less about idle curiosity than about trying to recenter our understanding of her art on facets of her craft, which I take to include insights about her materials and process, the particulars of place, and the personal values that have informed her art's expressiveness. This effort also insists that we understand her work as always embedded in time and place, in response and subject to specific pressures and opportunities and circumstances, of which the most significant are, in my view, her journey from the Jim Crow South to California's East Bay, Richmond's urban environment, her deep spirituality, and as well as Eli Leon's role as a patron and champion of her work. And just as an aside, I'll shift some of these historical circumstances by using her given name and then later Rosie Lee Tompkins, the pseudonym. So it's at these intersections of social difference, contrasting motivations, distinctive artistic traditions, and artistic agency that I hope we might work towards something more inclusive in how we think about art history, in which entrenched social and aesthetic hierarchies are weakened in their sway. Born to Sadie Bell and McCurry Martin in 1936, Effie Mae Martin grew up as one of 15 siblings in Gould, Arkansas. She would stay in this rural southeastern region until she, like millions of other African Americans who left the South for points north and west after World War I, summoned the determination to leave. As a 22-year-old woman in 1958, she arrived in the rapidly urbanizing areas of California's East Bay. Effie Mae Martin's reasons for leaving Arkansas are unknown, but escaping the oppressions of Jim Crow was surely a crucial factor. Lynchings and other kinds of racial terror were daily facts of life within a political system that ensured the supremacy of a white social class. And also caught within a sharecropping economy, which was slavery by another name, her family also faced dim economic prospects during her childhood and youth. So Martin joined roughly 1/3 of the African American population in Arkansas who left during the Great Migration and moved along the migratory stream to the west. Through some likely combination of kinship, friendship, and employment networks, she arrived in California and quickly seized on new opportunities. She enrolled in adult education classes in Berkeley and Oakland and worked as a practical nurse in convalescent homes. She eventually settled in Richmond, about 7 miles north of Berkeley, where she would live for nearly 4 decades. Richmond was a bustling place, owing to the transformation of its port into the Kaiser shipyards, as many of you probably know, one of World War II's most important shipbuilding centers. And as with other cities during this period, African American migrants brought with them distinctive aspects of Southern culture that they sustained in this new context, including blues music, folk healing, and sanctified worship practices. All of these cultural traditions offered a sense of care and belonging as these newcomers created thriving communities within an unfamiliar environment. The social rhythms and contours of Effie Mae Martin's life in the 1960s and 70s remain somewhat out of reach. Yet we do know that she married in 1963 and subsequently raised 5 children and stepchildren. Along the way, she also promoted herself as a maker of, quote, crazy quilts and pillows, all sizes, investing in printed business cards that suggest a commitment to the craft by at least the 1970s. Effie Mae Howard's early work seems to have consisted of smaller and custom pieces at sale at local flea markets. So what began as a practice, perhaps, to supplement her livelihood and possibly offer material comfort for patients under her care, evolved over the following decades into a fuller aesthetic project. Like other African American women who recreated Southern habits and structures in Richmond, Effie Mae Howard revived her interest in quilting to maintain ties with her family, and especially her mother, who still lived in Arkansas, and to give herself a pleasurable and profitable activity that could breathe new life into all kinds of fabric and secondhand clothing. Oh, here we go. The earliest quilts in the exhibition, which are here, point to aesthetic sensibilities and themes that she would develop over the years. In both the untitled applique quilt, started in 1968 at the left, and the patchwork quilt from the 1970s at right, we see an assortment of industrially produced textiles and decorative trims that she sought out and purchased from thrift stores and flea markets in the area. Such an array of materials were plentiful in urban geographies like Richmond, in which dense transient populations generated a ready supply of available secondhand clothing. Howard began the applique quilt in 1968, and the date 1983 stitched into the fabric denotes the year she returned to it, adding more jewelry, which we think is her term, and embroidery to its surface. And here we see chenille sweater fragments, snippets of beaded trims with sequins and faux pearls, and crochet doilies, all appliqued to red velvet and velveteen, making for a surface that is both lush and dazzling. The relationship between applique and assemblage also comes into focus in a set of three-dimensional works in which she assembles costume jewelry and all sorts of bric-a-brac into objects that somehow magically evoke the gleam of tinseled Christmas trees. And Christmas tree jugs is a term that she used to refer to some of these. The wonder of Baroque ornament and the density of floral surfaces. A variety of stitched floral motifs contributes to the homespun appearance of this 1970s patchwork quilt, where a found and sparsely stitched image of the Sacred Heart of Christ anchors its center. Howard has neatly added her own embroidery to the mix, sewing biblical verses that affirm Christian belief in faithful living. And as Larry mentioned, Howard was a longtime member of Beacon Light Seventh-day Adventist Church, along with her family, and these expressions of faith transform this irregular set of embroidered and appliqued fabrics into a kind of material prayer in needlework. And again, we'll see this approach extending throughout, even to her latest works. The only known quilt made by Sadie Lee Dale, Howard's mother, offers us some clues to the improvisatory quilting approach that Howard learned and built upon. Despite the faded, well-worn blocks at the center of Dale's quilt, we can still make out a central medallion surrounded by blocks of brighter, irregular squares and bars in the border that appear in her daughter's work. The visual effect is both familiar and exciting when we see them side by side, as Howard's boldly colored velvet and faux fur pieces create lines that teeter vibrantly around a pool of blues. This smaller example also illustrates Effie Mae Howard's version of a postage stamp pattern that isolates the checkerboard arrangement found in Dale's quilt. Mother and daughter's shared tendency towards flexible patterning here demonstrates an experimental approach that we see in other ways, where Howard explores a range of structural possibilities rather than adhering to a strict pattern. For example, a border may extend beyond a corner, or it may miss a clean closure completely, or it may only partially frame a set of patterned blocks to generate a set of interlocking shapes. And I just wanted to include this with a more traditional, say, a quilt that adheres to a more geometric and symmetrical motif, just to give you a visual sense of how some of Howard's work really do wonderfully work with this asymmetry. In other cases, half-square blocks seem to spontaneously multiply into two or more miniatures, or are coupled with sets of bars, resulting in dynamic and jagged patterns. and some of her largest, most spectacular velvet quilts manifest her aesthetic at its most sophisticated, such as this put together, in which bright and dark frames surround smaller pieced blocks. They are stacked together in a kind of meta-statement about the creative possibilities of shape, color, and mood that quilting offered her. Howard once reflected, quote, "I think it's because I love them so much that God let me see all these different colors," end quote. As if to reveal a cherished secret, her statement illuminates the way that Howard understood aspects of her quilting as a personal gift granted by a higher power. Perhaps this is one reason that velvet appealed to her as an expressive medium. With its capacity to reflect and absorb light simultaneously, with its variety of smooth and crushed finishes, and susceptibility to new textures with every stroke of its piles, or puckered seams, velvet, velour, and velveteen offer an immense range of expressive possibilities that Howard embraced. Their inviting softness also makes handling these textiles an especially intimate one, a quality that Howard also seems to harness when making quilts with specific family members in mind. For example, she created the red and black quilt while thinking of two of her brothers, and Leon recorded her talking about blue as a color she often used when thinking about her son, Alvin. Her 3/6 color scheme also commemorates relatives who all share the number 6 in their birth dates, often including herself, her grandfather, and an uncle or an aunt. Understood this way, her quilts gather ancestors and distant relatives together in a poignant union of color and fabric. And in some of her later works, she uses small pinwheel-like shapes called yo-yos to facilitate meditations on time and life's passing. On the left, 68 colorful rosettes stand in for her age at the time of making. And on the right, 6 black yo-yos accord with the number 6 of her cousin Calvin's birth date that she's also embroidered below. Surrounded by her name, birthday, and biblical references, this work comes across as somber as any headstone, but personally conceived and created. Much has been said about Rosie Lee Tompkins' reserved personality, but the sacredness with which she regarded her craft might also have informed her reluctance to let Eli Leon promote her work. Leon sought to highlight her originality and independence, whereas Howard understood quilting as fully dependent on and connected to the divine. Whether she relented to Leon's persistence, accepted the fact that her artworks were admired, or eventually was willing to sell them for appropriate compensation, we do not fully know. But several implications of Leon's involvement in collecting and showing Rosie Lee Tompkins' work follow from their relationship. Among them, Leon would purchase Tompkins' top and pay other quilters to adjust hems, finish borders, and ultimately quilt them. While such a division of labor is not uncommon and has long defined the communal aspects of quilting, Tompkins did not necessarily know the women who Leon paid to complete the quilting process. As a result, finished quilts often possess subtle patterning that should be attributed to the work of another. And in exceptional cases, the finished work differs dramatically from her original designs, as in string. We know that Tompkins' top buckled so unevenly that Willia Eddy Graham cut and restructured the work entirely so that it would lay flat, with the resulting in the final artwork's graceful arc. And moreover, Eli Leon's quilt scholarship tended to downplay certain aspects of Tompkins' art in ways that we're only now fully appreciating today. For Leon, qualities such as strip construction, use of multiple patterns, and technical accommodation of off-size pieces were just some of the traits that defined the aesthetic what he called Afro-traditional quilts. Through visual comparisons with African textiles like Kuba bark cloth and Yoruba dance aprons, Leon argued for the persistence of African modes of thought and design that he recognized in the predominantly abstract quilts that formed his collection. Yet we know now that abstraction was only part of Tompkins's body of work. Around the late 1990s, she began piecing fabrics containing images, creating large quilts that reveal another side of her contemporaneity and engagement with social and political themes. And I'll focus on one today. This tied quilt, assembled from found t-shirts and athletic wear, is a nuanced statement of solidarity with Black men. A particularly worn block features a series of Black political leaders such as Nelson Mandela, Malcolm X, and Elijah Muhammad. Other images spotlight the embattled status of Black heroism in the 1990s, as it was acutely registered in the lives of Black athletes. Here we see LA Lakers star Magic Johnson at the moment he publicly announced his HIV-positive status. And O.J. Simpson was another celebrated athlete whose public status shifted largely along fraught racial lines. And here, the related t-shirt fragment highlights some of the cynicism of African-American observers who suspected racist policing in asking, who framed O.J. Simpson? Only Michael Jordan seems to receive unadulterated praise, as indicated by an applique cross dedicated to him containing the word love. And I hope you can see that in the lower right. Nevertheless, the myriad of embroidered Bible verses pertaining to divine judgment and humility that she has stitched throughout this quilt suggests that Tompkins yielded ultimate judgment to her Christian beliefs. It is impossible to know if Tompkins would have created as much work as she did had Eli Leon not been present in her life. In the late 1970s, before their fateful encounter at a Marin flea market, she did suffer a nervous breakdown from unknown causes. Never fully able to recover, she turned to quilting as a spiritual practice with therapeutic effects and infused her art with prayers and biblical symbolism to an even greater extent. From this vantage, we might view her bursts of color and shape and stitching not just as aesthetic variations on certain quilting traditions, but as a material language and process for realizing complex emblems of personality and as a steadying force for psychological fragility. So consider here her use of this pumpkin-colored velour with a block in the upper right that seems to disintegrate to the edge. About this work, Tompkins declared that, quote, "the orange is me," end quote, as if admitting by inference the dark otherness that areas of her selfhood tries to contain. My sense is that Tompkins' spiritual and psychic motivation for her quilting would have endured with or without Eli Leon. Scholars have long recognized how acts of piecing and embroidery demonstrate the power of recreation amid states of fragmentation. And so in this late work that concludes the retrospective, we see both techniques converging. Her name, birth date, and collection of street addresses chronicle the particulars of her life, and you see that along the left edge. While some of her favorite scripture references run along the bottom. They are difficult to make out against the riotous gathering of half squares, bars, and blocks. But this monumental work at nearly 8 by 12 feet is something like a summation of what textiles were for her, a means of recording and expressing what mattered most. Only she truly understood their deepest meaning, but Leon preserved her artworks so that we might have the privilege of glimpsing at their beauty today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Elaine, for that wonderful, wonderful kick off to get us started, and thank you to you and to Larry for inviting and having me. Thank you, Sherry Goodman and Sean Carson here at BAMPFA for coordinating with me, and Lauren Pearson and Lori McAvee at ARC for giving me a delightful week-long residency here in Berkeley, full of incredible conversations with faculty, staff, students, and the people of this incredible, incredible ecosystem of a city. And Lisa, it is an honor to be in conversation with you, and thank you all for coming. When I think of the work of Rosie Lee Tompkins and the resultant work of the women who quilted her pieces, I cannot help but view the work through the lens of what was called in the post-World War II years a cultural poetics, and what we called when I was in grad school new historicism. As a way of thinking and framing, as a hermeneutics, new historicism allows us to understand intellectual history through literature by attending to and gleaning out of the characters' motives and stakes a cultural context. And I have always felt that if we can read a literary text for cultural context, surely the materialities of a visual text offer equally chewy subjects, objects, and predicates for our interrogation. What strikes me about Tompkins's work is that she serves up not just a cultural context, but testifies to the power and the depths of a life of faith. We have the worldly made manifest in the broad and networked materiality of the textile planes, and we have the otherworldly, the spiritual imagination, what we might call the romantic imaginary, mediates between these two levels of existence and action via the machinery and the techniques of something we might call, and that I would offer and argue for, transcendence. Transcendence is something that the poet Mary Oliver was known for, the flight of geese over a pond that encapsulates mercy, glory, and the humbling knockout punch of grace. Transcendence is something that Mark Rothko strived for, and that Alice Coltrane purposefully embraced and elided in her atmospheric jazz chants. And perhaps most notably for me as a curator, transcendence and apotheosis from the category of being a Black artist or a woman artist to simply being an artist was a transcendent prerogative for the legacies of folks like Norman Lewis, the Bay's own Mary Lovelace O'Neill, and, of course, the ongoing quest of Sam Gilliam. I think it is safe to say that we come to the rich ground of exploration around Tompkins's work if we attend to transcendence and, as a stakes, a categorical imperative rich with religious mores and identity politics. My prepared remarks this afternoon begin with an analysis of string taken from my catalog essay for the exhibition, and then moves through a few modalities of the transcendent that I hope will offer rich threads that we can weave together in the conversation to follow. And I offer these thoughts, such as they are, not as a definitive interpretation, but as access points and ways of beginning an encounter with Tompkins that presupposes the full interplay between faith, intellect, humor, and the brilliance of a woman's form. In string, curvilinear lines of light swirl around space. On the leading lower edge, the parabolas break and uplift into a panoply of blocked color. And on the right edge, at midground, the parabolas break into regions of red, green, and black, the colors of the Pan-African flag. At midground, below, and swirling through, tendrils of red and blue interact against a darker horizontal region, somewhat jagged and unformed. Overall, the piece resembles a motion capture of the night sky, and the rising and setting of stars before the camera's aperture forming strings of light across the dark. At just over 8 feet by 7 feet, String is a swirling, visionary masterpiece. One thinks of textile pieced work is all about foresight and control, yet upon reflection, the work is an assemblage of parabolas with no intersection and no center, offering the viewer the ability to read chance and rhythm into the integrated structure. And as Elaine has just so beautifully, thoughtfully, and rigorously pointed out, this is the work of many hands. So as we look at this piece, we can even think of even more curvilinear and loose spaces of play. The rings of color are whirling around a center node just outside the frame, just barely sensed and traced. There are no right angles forming the edges of the picture plane. The velvet and the velveteen catch, curve, and scatter light. Every individual element is shifting, contracting, expanding, suturing sight to the touch and polyphony of sound. It is not so hard to imagine the central force that we cannot see as an incarnation of the divine creator God, and the work as being interpretation of the energy and sensation of the divine. We might even imagine the incredible words of James Weldon Johnson's first sermon of God's trombones, which begins with, quote, "stepping out on space, rolling the light around in his hands until he made the sun, God created the world." The darker region at center is the formless promise of the earth before being shaped, and Tompkins has chosen to demarcate that potentiality with material less conducive to reflecting light than the ruse surfaces it is set against. With several twitches upon many threads, Tompkins has brought us back to the origin of all stories and the creation of the primary formal element of art, which is light. To my eye, string is unprecedented in Tompkins' oeuvre and in work in the late modern period. Coming in Tompkins' prolific period between the late 1980s and 90s, string aggregates certain patterns that can serve to unlock certain broad themes of faith. For example, in conversations with Eli Leon, we come to understand that Tompkins' choice of colors and forms often come from colors and shapes that rose to the fore of her mind during this later period as she read biblical passages and reflected upon their meaning. We can understand the blocks of color at the left edge of string as a simplified geometric abstraction of biblical pages redoubled in red, green, and black on the opposite side of the work. Could the colors of black liberation signify that Tompkins found liberation in the sacred text? Might the void or the gulf between the lemon yellow of aged handled pages and Jesus' squared red letter words signify a heart removed from the beatific vision, but seeking, a heart feeling migratory? We cannot know, and yet we are given permission to wonder. In 1999, the philosopher and historian of American culture, Elaine Yau, published a work that has been really instrumental to my thinking since high school. It was entitled On Being, On Beauty, and Being Just. Drawing heavily from a series of lectures Yau gave at Harvard in the late 90s, the work proposes that it's the quotidian themes, the way we pray, the way we pass coffee to a lover in the morning, the streaks a lawnmower makes on a front lawn, the fronds of a palm tree, that provide those of us blessed with sight the ability later in life to discern aesthetic beauty. Yau is here riffing on Theodore Parker and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when she spells out a quote that I remember at 19 and have learned by heart. If we allow it, if we follow its lilting tune, the work of beauty should lead us to justice. She's riffing here on what Parker and King declared that, quote, while the arc of the moral universe and, quote, the arc of history are long, they bend toward justice. But what is justice in the self-trained art of craft? What is justice through divine eyes? And how, if, as the Black church often reifies, God's ways are not our ways, God's wisdom is not our wisdom, how do we understand beauty in the efficacy of artistic choice when the machinations of the good and the purposeful are at a cosmic scale? This is the question which Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in 1710 termed theodicy. And I would love, as I continue speaking and in our conversation, to perhaps come back to that idea of theodicy, which is, how does one live a faithful life in a world of evil? The handiwork of Rosie Lee Tompkins' mind and the craft of her hands and the hands of the women who quilted the works offer us an immersive pleasure, humor, and refinement in formal complexity. The work inhabits the malleable and shifting space between artistic and political poles, high and low, feminized labor and mastery, conformist and disobedient, individual genius versus a guild practice, and the boundary between craft, utilitarian object, and art. As Berkeley's own Julia O'Brien Wilson attests, such work, quote, wreaks visual and thus political havoc, end quote. Decades before the phenomenon that Brian Wilson terms craftism, meaning the politics and social practices associated with hand-making, Tompkins instrumentalized textiles as a way to make visible and tangible the experience of being in the presence of the divine. There are many theological frameworks attuned to unearthing the malleable nature of God and how God's self is manifest in the phenomenological world. But per Tompkins' own words, we are in search of a material divine, a divine who instructs the artist towards certain fabrics and certain geometric tessellations for the way they catch the light and move the viewer's heart. What I find fascinating about Tompkins' work is that they amplify and engage the millennia-old importance of textiles at the heart of the Abrahamic faith traditions. We can think of Joseph's coat of many colors, the veil of Veronica, Moses' blanket in the Nile, woven from bulrushes, strips of fabric, and cooking grease, John the Baptist's camel hair tunic and leather belt, Queen Esther's silks and robes of pearls, the veil over the Holy of Holies, and how in Islamic and Christian mysticism that veil was ripped at the crucifixion. Miriam's dropping of the needlepoint when the angel Gabriel appears, the scarlet robes worn by the woman in the sky in Revelations, and of course, in that first very story, the skins that God sewed Adam and Eve before they left the garden. We also must keep in mind histories of sumptuary laws that since the early modern period have governed what fabrics, jewelry, and silhouettes those of various classes and religious adherents under colonial and hegemonic rule could wear. And of course, we must never forget how clothing was so important to Black traditions in the New World. Tompkins's pieces are not quilts. They are not meant to keep a body warm. They are not meant to comfort. They are meant to keep the mind and the heart electric, pulsing, malleable, and searching for God. As works of art, her work cannot be touched in the gallery, yet everything about their materiality begs to be held, felt, explored with open palm, to be encountered. And is that not how we encountered the divine? We want intimacy, and intimacy is disavowed, just as pure knowing of God's nature is disavowed. It is in contemplation of Tompkins's work that I'm reminded that Black Christianity in the Americas is deeply radical and deeply communal, an effort to redraw and delimit the bounds of family because one's ancestral lands and lineage have often been ripped away. I am reminded that while not universally enforced, many states during Tompkins's own life had limits on the number of Americans of African descent who could legally gather in one place on the books throughout the 1960s, with the church being the one exception. As we know, as some of us have seen on TV, houses of worship are still where political candidates seeking the black vote go and frequent, and where baby boomers and older black Americans still get their local and regional news. Gathering together in the presence of the Spirit was akin to a wish for and an activation of social justice. Even before Justinian and Theodora made Christianity the state religion of the Eastern Holy Roman Empire in the 6th century, the home church was a subculture for non-citizens in the Roman Empire and a refuge for those who did not have a secure place in society. For prostitutes, those with criminal records, doctors and nurses who handled dead bodies, the non-binary, those we would term queer. Christianity is one of the first religions in the modern world to say that the communities and family you choose is more important than the ties to the family you were born into. The piecework of the quilt has long been symbolic of ritual practices lost in the Middle Passage and new rituals, new materials, new families, new places gathered to the self in the Americas. Earlier, I termed Tompkins's practice as a visionary one, and I wish to bolster this plane by thinking a bit more abstractly, yet perhaps more specifically, about the legacies and radical histories of the evangelical tradition in the United States. And for our focus, I'd argue that the radical and ethical traditions of the Spirit that Tompkins is drawing from here are the religious tradition of Seventh-day Adventists and its broad interconnectivities with American transcendentalism, which draws most immediately on Enlightenment-era German idealism and Hindu-based yogic practice. What's interesting is when religious belief and ritual informs your relational aesthetics to the people and entities around you. So, for instance, many Seventh-day Adventists believe that the body is the new tabernacle of the divine, and many leaders of that tradition would advocate not only abstaining from tobacco, drugs, and alcohol, but also adopting a vegetarian or vegan lifestyle. For this reason, the World Council of Churches regularly recognizes that Seventh-day Adventists live an average 7 to 8 years longer than other devout Christians. So quickly we can see how a moral stance takes on a practice, here meaning an ethical visibility in relation to one's actions, inactions, and surroundings. It is of note that Seventh-day Adventists first gathered and named themselves in Silver Spring, Maryland in the spring of 1863. This is really important, Maryland being between Virginia and Pennsylvania, the epicenters of death during the U.S. Civil War. At the time of its founding, Gettysburg had not yet happened, so by numerical totals, the bloodiest battle of the war was fought in Maryland. And it still gripped the national consciousness 2 months after its moment when Seventh-day Adventists gathered. We still know that the bloodiest day of battle ever fought by U.S. troops in any armed combat was the Battle of Antietam, 5 miles from Silver Spring, Maryland. Imagine in an 8-hour period, 23,000 humans mortally wounded, particularly in 1863, when the entire population of the United States, if we count slaves as full persons, as they were not at that time, is 10 million. 23,000 persons, when the entire population is only 10 million. Seventh-day Adventism was the first denomination that did not have segregated balconies. They worshiped together in the fields. This battle was so bad, Antietam, that 5 days after it, Lincoln made the Emancipation Proclamation to bring the enslaved and those who ran away into the battlefield. So the belief that God intervenes in human affairs, by doling out horror and speaking to his beloved, is at the core of Seventh-day Adventism because they saw it. The second coming, the apocalypse, is not a metaphor, it's not an idea, it's not an allegory, it's not a trope. It is real and immediate. It could happen at any time, so one had best always be ready. One had best always be prepared. One had always be in a meditative Sabbath. Yeah. And so thinking about the idea of stitching as a meditative yogic practice of the mind and the heart, bringing everything of the spirit in line with the eye and the hand, is something deeply, deeply fascinating when we think about the incredible intimacies, complexities, and intricacies of Tompkins's labor. It is in thinking through these transcendental and visionary roots of Seventh-day Adventism that I think we can attend to the idea of recurrence that is at the heart of what I was calling cultural poetics. Emerson gave his famous talk in 1838 at the Harvard Divinity School, which actually was quite shocking for his sense that those who are of the elect are already guaranteed to go into heaven. Emerson said, no, that is not true. The elect are those who experience the world through their senses. We become all souls. We become the all-seeing I, right? That in order to move through the world, in order to transcend the bounds, in order to be worthy of divine grace, we must be gracious to all entities. And the only way to do that is to use touch and sight and sense, to become a sensorium, to make our lives the beautiful work, to recreate in ourselves the Garden of Eden. This was deeply problematic for the Puritan Universalists, because in order to be a Puritan Universalist, you have to read, right? Protestantism is based on reading. You cannot be a good Protestant if you cannot read, right? And so one of the things that the Seventh-day Adventists did was to take from Emerson, through the incredible writings and ruminations of Ellen White, who in 1844 was rereading Emerson's Harvard Divinity School speech, thinking about the early flourishing of abolitionism, and thinking about how one can be in solidarity with the world and in an always meditative, prayerful space. And from her flowerings, from a deep understanding of scripture coming out of the Second Great Awakening, we have Seventh-day Adventism. But I argue, think about what it was like for Rosie Lee Tompkins, who had migrated, who had built a life, who had cared for family, extended families, and cared in her community for people who were sick and dying, who felt that the work of her hands was a prayerful gift, a prayerful offering to the divine, who felt truly that God spoke through her hands, that spoke through her words, and yet Seventh-day Adventism still does not allow the ordination of women. And so, as good people do, you ordain yourself. And you make incredible work that transforms all who see. Walking in Berkeley the other day, I passed this painting outside of a local head shop, and it occurred to me that the zigzag formulations and tessellations of Tompkins's work are deeply symbolic, a deeply symbolic visual archetype for something so central to the soul wrestling with the divine, and that's the zip, the meander, the back and forth momentum of a human soul trying to get free, trying to transcend. Transcendence is not epiphany, it's not translation, it's not transubstantiation. It is a moving of forms, of identity across the very bounds of time, between the worldly and the unworldly. It is a wrestling with the God in the midst of a tradition and a world in peril. The zip, the line, how the works emulate the transcendence of sainthood is incredible. I'm reminded of the Bishop Hezekiah Walker song, who is also a Seventh-day Adventist, which was very popular in the mid to late 90s, with the lyrics that are so simple, yet so at the core, I think, of Black radical traditions of faith. We fall down and we get up. We fall down and we get up. We fall down, but we get up. For a saint is just a sinner who fell down and got up. To transcend, to be in the presence of the divine, is a bent, broken, curvilinear line. It is a journey and a pilgrimage toward a justice of the self. It is contingency and pure presence. It makes the surfaces sculptural by adding dimensionality and time. All of these tessellations recede and accede. Yeah? We are walking through a sanctuary. We are walking through a graveyard. We are walking through the very bones of Gethsemane. All of that is here, right? In the what we call the theological way that we read Scripture, everything in the Old Testament is reflected in the New Testament. The Old Covenant must have a New Covenant. Everything is cyclical. Everything is important. Everything is stitched and sutured into the fabric of the soul. In her works, Tompkins favors these cinematic open structures with vortexes swirling around centers of accumulation that end not when the plane ends, but just outside of the edges of our sight. This image, where a phylon of abstracted crosses march punch-drunk beyond the frame. But these simulations of embodied movement that play out in the zigzag of our vision across the picture plane, they give us something quite special. They give us a refusal to frame, a refusal for a linear or straight or closed composition. They refuse safety. And isn't that so true of what it means to live a life when one is seeking the presence of transcendence and the divine? One gives and loses all to transcend. There are no pure, essentialized forms in Tompkins's work, but there is rich complexity of the spirit and rich complexity of meaning. And I don't know about you, but I am so thankful for her life. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. It is a total honor, and I am not an expert on the work of Rosie Lee Tompkins. I'm a student of her work. I just saw it for the first time yesterday, and I am going to just lay another story, I think, next to the stories that have been told, and share a little bit about my work on quilts, mourning, remembrance, and African American lives. So I wanted to start here, though, with my father and me, probably in the 70s. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, but I don't think this is Cleveland. I believe this might be the Lower East Side. And I love this picture of me and my dad because it was something we did, which is that if there was no room for me to play, I used him as like a human jungle gym. So this is me swinging on his bicep, which I love too, because at the end of his life, he was very, very weak. And so this image kind of fortifies me a bit. But the reason why I started writing about quilts was actually to kind of piece together myself, to make myself whole. I thought, I need to learn the lessons of quilts and of quilt makers, because I think that they know anguish and have lessons to learn. And when I was walking through the exhibition yesterday, I got really pulled into this piece. This is just a detail, but it's the quilt, if you haven't seen it, that includes Martin Luther King Jr. flanked by the Kennedy brothers. And this is just a little detail of the Serenity Prayer. And so many people know the Serenity Prayer, but it usually goes something like, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And this was incredible for me to see because at the end of my dad's life, when we had shifted over to hospice care, and we were just looking for ways for him to find comfort and meaning, all he wanted at that time was fresh water. He wanted a navy blue fleece blanket that I think I bought from Land's End. Washed it a lot so it was super soft. And I know he told me it felt good on his skin. And he wanted the Serenity Prayer hung so he could see it from his bedside. And then he just wanted his family to gather around him. So to see that quilt with the Serenity Prayer also reminded me just about comfort and about piecing for cover, piecing for comfort, piecing or writing to make oneself whole again. The quilt I've been looking at in my research as I think about mourning is this quilt here by Missouri Petway. I saw it at the Whitney Museum probably 2003 when it was coming through from Houston as part of the Quilts of Gee's Bend exhibition. And at the time I saw it, I was super pregnant, and I was going through the exhibition with a really good friend who's a social historian at NYU, and I loved being with her, and I loved seeing this show, and I definitely noticed this quilt. It was when you come out off the steps, and there was the quilt, and then there was testimony, oral history to go with the quilt. And the testimony to go with this quilt said that the quilt had been made by Missouri Petway in 1941 in Gee's Bend, Alabama, while she was newly mourning the loss of her husband. And the oral history that went with it was by her then adult daughter, who said this: as remembered by her eldest daughter, Missouri Petway expressly designed this quilt to meet the needs of her grief, to support her grieving self and assist in holding and carrying the memory of her husband who had recently passed on. Recalling her mother's stated desire in making her cotton covering, Arlanzia Petway recounted, and I quote, "Mama said, I'm going to take his work clothes, shape them into a quilt to remember him, and cover up under it for love." So this is a quilt, as you can see, made of utilitarian fabric. And so I was drawn to some of the similar ones made with denim, repurposed denim, in the exhibition. And I thought, denim is so tough. It's so, it's going to be bloody fingers trying to get a needle through that thick utilitarian cloth. But I thought also the idea of using utilitarian cloth might also be a good place to think about some of the utility of quilts and their making. Because it seems like this idea of quilts and their making is holding space to dwell on loved ones, including those who have passed on, to express love, and to deepen our connections to self, others, as well as the divine, also resonates with Rosie Lee Tompkins's creative practice. In my own research and writing, these are two quilts from the exhibition. One is 2003 with the crosses that you can see on the small denim top. And here a really big quilt, 1986, found and repurposed denim. In my research and writing, I've been thinking on the idea of quilts and their making as sustaining resources and practices, including in expressing love and longing and intending sorrow and giving form and shape to grief. Some of the questions central to my work are, what are some of the things people in mourning need and feel to do? Where are the sites and what are the roles for creativity in grief? This fundamental human emotion and experience of profound distress prompted by loss. And how might a closely crafted material object, specifically a quilt, in its conception, making, and use, serve the excruciating work of grieving a loved one? I'm going to offer just a little bit, very shortly here, a little bit of my research on this idea of quilts, mourning, and remembrance within African American lives, and we can see maybe in Q&A and conversation if it resonates with any aspects of Effie Mae Howard's life and work. After her husband's dying and death in 1941, Missouri Petway decided to create a quilt to support her grieving self, as a way, it seems, to meet and tend her grief and express her love, loss, and longing. Eminently practical and infinitely wise, Missouri Petway's decision to make a quilt while newly suffering loss resonates closely with decisions made by other individuals in mourning. And one site where the recurrence of this anguished, intentional act is especially evident is within the literature devoted to quilts and African American lives. For running like a sturdy, steady thread through this literature are examples of and testimonies by individuals who have drawn on quilts and their making and use as vital resources in the excruciating work of grieving a loved one. And to do this work, it was just really a wonderful experience. I just took some of my favorite books off of my shelf, and actually many of the books have a Bay Area connection to them. Certainly Alice Walker was the first book. And this book, I think you can see, 1983, how much it's been loved. It's actually never left my desk. It just barely goes back to the shelf. It's just so useful all the time. So what I did is I re-immersed myself in some of this classic literature, and I read it between the lines a bit to see what the authors say implicitly or explicitly about quilting and grieving. So I'll just show you a little bit what I pulled off from my shelf here. And again, there's many Berkeley and Bay Area connections that I'm seeing because I'm here now. Many of these people have passed away recently. This is a book actually from a small press publisher in the Bay Area. It was before Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, the novel came out. She had a little chapbook. And then Patricia Turner's book, I believe the oral histories that come through this book are when she was, I think she's at UCLA now, but I think it's when she was living in the Bay Area, working at UC Davis and part of the African American Quilt Guild of Oakland. So let me just share a little bit of some of the things from these books about what they say about quilting and grieving. Patricia Turner's crafted lives, stories, and studies of African American quilters implicitly engages this topic of quilting and grieving, shining some light on ways quilts and loss intersect. Interested in exploring the roles and meanings of quilts within people's lives, Turner, a folklorist and quilter, held extensive conversations with 9 quilt makers who identify as African American creators. Of the 9 individuals profiled in her rich book, 5 of them, through their words and their work, reveal links between practices of quilt making and processes of grieving. For two of the quilters, Jeanette Rivers and Elliot Chambers, grief served as the impetus for them to make quilts. And in the process, both surviving spouses found the expressive and intentional act and art of quilt making helpful, including in passing anguished time with meaning and purpose, and in tenderly supporting remembrance. After losing a son to street violence, Ora Knoll created a quilt in her son's likeness to simultaneously honor him, assist in the work of stopping violence in her community, and comfort herself. 6 years later, when this tragedy horrifically repeated itself and a second son of hers was murdered, the traumatized quilter and activist responded once again by making a likeness quilt, achingly explaining that her quilt making provided, a quote, a fraction of healing by redirecting the inner pain. For Marion Coleman, another profiled quilter, it was the experience of seeing a quilt made of mourning clothes that inspired her to take up quilting. Recalling what she remembered of this exceptionally moving and catalytic quilt in the exhibition where it was displayed, she shared, I do remember it had a very old quilt made by a woman who had taken all of her mourning clothes for it. They were all black. Something about that really touched me. Someone saving their garments and showing her respect and love for a relationship, and showing that by dressing a certain way, then taking that and transforming that so that she could still have it to cover her. And in her recollection, it reminded me a little bit of the quilt, the black one made out of the bed sheet with the yo-yos that's in the exhibit. While three of the quilters who linked quilts and loss in Crafted Lives shared stories of quilts and their making as supporting needs of their grief, and one quilter shared a story of a mourning quilt that had held her heart and inspired her to take up the practice, a fifth quilter, profiled by Patricia Turner, shared a life story of needing to put her established quilt-making practice on hold while newly suffering the death of her husband. Longtime quilter Daisy Anderson Moore explained that the experience of losing her beloved husband prompted her to stop making quilts for a while, precisely because her quilting had been so closely tied to his enthusiasm, encouragement, and joy for her work. Describing her painful predicament, she stated, I can't get into quilting as much as I did when he was living, because every time I'd make something, I'd say to him, see this? Look what I made, and I finished that. Maud Sothwell-Wallman's classic book, Signs and Symbols, African Images in African American Quilts, also casts light on the topic of quilts and loss, providing insight into how closely crafted and lovingly made objects can serve mourning and remembrance. Among the textile artists featured by the art historian are two sisters, Rose Perry Davis and Edlento Perry Warner of Orlando, Florida. The two adult sisters share how, after the death of their mother, they decided to make quilts and other sewn creations from the worn and well-remembered clothes left in her closet. When finished with their work, the artists, whose mother had taught them both to sew, generously presented these intimate memorials to members of their family. One especially cherished offering was the quilt the surviving sisters and loving daughters gave to their newly widowed father. Reflecting on the tender utility of this precious quilt, Rose Perry Davis recounted, I think that the beautiful thing is that even though Mom is no longer with him, every winter he can sleep under something that she wore during their marriage. Pearlie Jackson Posey, another quilt maker profiled in Signs and Symbols, also shines light on links between quilts, mourning, and remembrance. The quilt maker, whose farming mother died when she was a child, shared a story she carried close. how her dying mother had spent her last living days piecing quilt tops for her infant daughter, to remember her by. Pearlie Jackson Posey also shared that she had sustained and passed on her mother's loving intention and desire to have her handmade quilt tops assist in sustaining memory, supporting remembrance, and serving as sanctuary. For later, when Pearlie Jackson Posey had children of her own, she made quilts for them with a similar sentiment, to hold her love, explaining to them, "Then, if the Lord take me and I leave you, you'll have some covers." Roland Freeman's essential book, A Communion of the Spirits, African American Quilters, Preservers, and Their Stories, is laden with internal and external evidence of links between quilts and loss. In it, the photographer, folklorist, and quilt collector interweaves pieces of his own life story and the centrality of quilts to it within his extensive survey of African American quilt makers living in the U.S. Between his own testimony and the testimonies of the artists he interviewed as part of his decades-long fieldwork, Freeman's book includes many examples of how quilts are drawn on as resources for living, dying, and healing. Makers, users, and keepers of quilts share stories, both singular and shared, of quilts wrapped around and buried with the dead, of quilts or pieces of them placed in and on caskets, at grave sites, and in one case at a former murder site to aid in healing. Roland Freeman's study, particularly his own life sharing, reveals ways quilts may be of use not only in serving and honoring the dead and comforting the grieving, but also in healing the living. Quilt-minded from birth, Freeman shares how from his earliest childhood memories he sensed that some very special quilts carried a powerful spiritual presence that could, when properly assessed, provide a means of connection with those no longer physically present and the world beyond. He sensed that quilts could serve as material crossroads, as potent sites where the human meets the divine. He was also aware that some quilts, like his own family's healing quilt, could support health and well-being. Freeman's insights were further strengthened when he was struggling with a life-threatening illness, and he experienced, through a dream and a quilt, direct communion with a beloved deceased grandmother. This was a warm and welcome visit he credits with protecting him and supporting his own healing and recovery. Of his powerful communion of the spirits, he writes, "One night, in a dream, my grandmother Goldie appeared, putting a quilt over me and saying, 'You'll be all right now.' But it wasn't the family healing quilt. It was Betty Tolbert's red, black, and white strip quilt. In the middle of the night, I got Mrs. Tolbert's quilt out of storage and slept under it. Little by little, I began to feel better. My meditation room became my sanctuary. I would light all the candles on the altar and begin to look inward, past the pain, past the mental anguish, going deeper and deeper into the inner sanctum of my soul to find my inner light, to find the necessary strength to live." For me, dwelling in quilts began years ago with the study of one quilt made in mourning and the memory of its making. But what I have come to more fully appreciate, and what the Rosie Lee Tompkins exhibition seems to confirm, is that the holistic, interdisciplinary study of quilts and their makers, users, and keepers enables expansive thinking on human suffering, resilience, creativity, and grace. Thank you.
All right. So let's see. I think you have to turn this on. Okay, thank you to the panelists. Wonderful presentations. I want to begin our conversation with a few questions to Sammy Howard, who is Rosie Lee Tompkins' son. And I'm so glad you could be with us here today, Sammy.
Wonderful to be here.
Great. So I do want to start by asking a kind of a simple question, a practical question. I know that your mother sold her works at flea markets. In fact, that's where she met Eli Leon, or he met her. Can you recollect which ones she went to and what kind of things she sold at these markets?
My earliest memory is co-op flea market. I don't know, Ashby and Telegraph used to be down there. That's my earliest. She used to go there, and then she went to Berkeley Flea Market. Also Marin, where they met. She met Eli there, and she sold pillows. You know, she sold pillows and a few quilts. She wasn't really into it that heavy at that time. Mm-hmm. And fur. They were fur. They were very exotic. You know,
fur.
Fur pillows. Yes, yes.
And fur quilts too?
No, not the fur. Just fur pillows, yeah.
There's some faux fur in the ones out there. From the ridiculous to the sublime, can you tell us something, your recollection about her spirituality? We know she was, a congregant at the Seventh Adventist Church in Richmond, but what was spiritual life in the family like, and what did she share with you about her faith?
My mom was very spiritual. She wasn't religious, but she was spiritual, and there was a lot of love in our home, and I'm the oldest. So I would take my brothers and sisters to church when she didn't go. I'd drive everybody to the Beacon Light Seventh-day Adventist Church, where I grew up. And it was just, she's very spiritual. I remember when I was going overseas and we went to the SFO, I said, Mom, I'm scared. She said, just pray. And I said, that's it? Do you love me? But that's how she just believed in God. That's, yeah. And it's still, yeah. So
did she go to the church there frequently, like every week, or?
In the beginning, she did. But then once I got my license and everything, and she didn't feel like it, here, you take the kids to church.
Got it. Okay. So I want to ask about your mother's relationship with Eli Leon. You knew Eli, right? And
yes, I did.
You saw them together. How would you describe their relationship? Were they friends? What was the relationship like?
I think their friendship grew as they got to know each other, and they confided in each other a lot. And she told Eli a lot of things I didn't even know, because I had a family of my own. I was working. I was trying to find my way in the world. And so, yeah, they became really, really good friends towards the end. I'd say the last 15 or so years, yeah.
Do you think they ever socialized in a non-quiltish way?
No, that didn't happen. I know that didn't happen. No, just business.
Your quilts.
It was just, yeah. It was just business. So it was great. They were identical. Their homes were the same. You had to step over stuff. I mean, quilts piled this high. They were identical. They became really good friends towards the end.
That's very cool. So you've described your mother, I've heard you say this, as ahead of her time. What do you mean by that?
Renaissance. She had so many irons in the fire. She was a Girl Scout leader. We had everything at our home, and she just had a vision that it was just unexplainable. She even wrote a play one time, and I couldn't believe it. Yeah.
Do you have that play?
Yeah, I think I do.
Okay, let's talk.
I think I do. I think I do. Yeah.
She was a very wonderful woman.
Yes. Very, very loving. Our family was very loving. I mean, we went everywhere. She, and she gave us, space to express ourselves, because I was in high school in the 60s. So, you know about the 60s and 70s. So, she just gave me a lot of freedom to express myself.
Yeah, that's great. Terrific. Well, good. Well, I want to turn to our panelists and ask a couple questions. Lisa, thank you so much. I think there is some grief in Rosie Lee Tompkins' work, particularly in the quilt with Martin Luther King and the Kennedys, and there's that kind of black stripe that runs vertically right next to them, which if you look closely, you'll see is covered in little red hearts, which is kind of wonderful. But for me, the predominant feeling in her work is one of joy and kind of celebration and reverence. And so I'm curious if you think there is, and I think sort of quilts of joy and quilts of grief have something in common, that it's love. Love is kind of the thing that connects them. But formally, are there differences between quilts of grief and quilts of joy?
Is that right? Okay. No, I think that the emotion behind it doesn't necessarily show up in a formal way. I think that in reading the oral histories that she did with Eli Leon, I definitely thought there was a recurrence of her saying, I'm using quilts so that I can deepen my connections to my loved ones, deepen my connections to God, deepen connections to myself. And I just thought, that's also a very powerful emotion to be guiding your creative practice. So I think
I get the sense, and I even from speaking with her the couple times that I did, that she was more interested in the act of making than in the finished product. And I wonder if you could talk about that in relationship to quilts and grief.
That's interesting. Well, I've been looking at the quilt from the 40s from Gee's Bend, and at that time it seems like what was the dominant way, and this is again in the 1940s in Alabama, but it was for people to piece by themselves, that was a solitary act. And so, I've been thinking about why that would you'd have something, if it was hand done, on your lap, give you space to go inwards. A lot of the Gee's Bend quilters talk about using that for worship and prayer and singing. And then the quilting, the bringing all the 3 layers of the quilt and making it into an actual quilt, in that context in the 40s, was often collective. Right. And so you both, in the making and the process, have a time to go inwards and a time to kind of build and sustain community.
Yeah, very interesting. Horace, I understand you were training to be a priest. You could have been one.
They said my sermons were bad.
Oh! No, it's not so.
Thank you.
So you said something in passing that I just have to return to because it's so tantalizing to me. You mentioned that the origins of Seventh-day Adventism can be traced to sort of German Romanticism and Hinduism. And of course, when you look at Rosie Lee Tompkins' quilts, one of the things that jumps out at me is their connection to mandalas and even tantric art. So is there a thread there, or should I let go?
No, I don't think you should let go. I think so much about American traditions are deeply syncretic, right? And are deeply panoplies and palimpsests. That's the beauty of everything in our nation, right? From its very people to our trees and to our songs and to our music traditions. And so there was something, I think that's why, Emerson's version of transcendentalism was so radical, because it wasn't just on this kind of Catholic, then Anglicanism, then Episcopalianism, then kind of Puritan Protestant Congregationalism in New England. It was like, we are one with the earth, and the earth changes us, and we are clearly changing it. And thus, we have to be deeply capacious and expansive in who we are. And I think that for a variety of reasons, I think Black radical traditions and Black traditions of faith are necessarily capacious and necessarily deeply open, because it is realized that there is a well of memory that was lost, and there is a well of memory that can be rebuilt by defining a community. And we are always in ethno and ecological community with the world. We can also be in community with ourselves. So no, I don't think we let go. I think in some ways we go back to, as far as we can go, we go back to those tantric traditions. We go back to those, what Emerson and Whitman called the Vedas and the Vedic traditions. And we try to figure out what in this Romantic moment, American Renaissance, early modern period, antebellum period, what was so exciting for a political left to look outside Europe for places to draw strength and guidance and moral fiber from.
Yeah, thank you. In your text in the catalog, you have the phrase, "The works serve as architectures of spiritual experience physically, optically, and sonically." And you mentioned sound or music in your presentation today. Can you talk a little bit more about the sonic dimension of Rosie Lee Tompkins' quilts? What music you hear?
That's a beautiful question. Color has a synesthesiatic quality. Color vibrates, color moves us, and of course, in many faith traditions, one demarcates time by wearing different colors, different vestments, and different fabrics. You don't wear silk, say, when you're preparing for Easter and death and resurrection, but you could wear them, say, during Christmas. That vestments are there, and of course, those colors and those vestments determine the hymnody and the liturgy, right? And whether we process or whether we sit and stand, when we kneel, when we pray, there's always a sonics of breath, a sonics of space, a sonics of procession and movement, and a prosonics of the voice. And so for me, walking through the exhibition a little bit yesterday and then today, and watching children run and play and be so intimate with the material world, saying, I know what that thing is, it enlivened in me that for someone who is piecing on lap on a table, they're humming to themselves, they're talking to themselves, or they're talking to a friend, or they might have to answer the phone, they're singing hymns, they might even prick themselves and utter an ouch or whatever else things they might utter at the time. But there is a sonic quality to, I think, makers and traditions that I really felt, particularly as in her words through Eli, she's thinking about sermons in her head. She's hearing them over and over again. She's reciting scriptural phrases. She's remembering them, so that even the intoning of them in stitch, the intoning of a Bible verse, you are saying it, right? It stands in for the vocative, the vocal.
Yeah. Thank you. Elaine, you've delved incredibly deeply into her biography, the relation between her biography and the works. And I wonder, after all of the reading and interviewing that you've done, what mysteries remain? What would you most like to know about her art and life?
Thanks for that question, Larry. I think I should say up front that one lesson of her quilts, and I think that has come through the talks, is knowing when to leave certain mysteries as they are, in a way of sort of respecting both her process, again, sort of the deep thoughts of God, of her life, and sort of as a scholar, knowing when to discipline oneself and sort of not wanting to, knowing when certain questions just don't have answers. So I think that's, one lesson that was very salient throughout the process. But to answer more positively, I think with the sheer number of quilts that you and I saw, for example, I think there is still work to be done as far as understanding some of the early work, Sammy, that you were talking about, the pillows and quilts, and kind of understanding more of that evolution and really seeing when like the first velvet emerges, or at what point do these really beautiful yo-yo, these commemorative pieces come up. And there are a few of Eli Leon's friends and assistants who are still here, and I've had the pleasure of talking with them. And sometimes even they don't have the answers. I think simply because Eli was very protective of his relationship with Tompkins. So again, more speculation still remains, but I think it's clear that, especially in some of the embroideries, her numerology that was so personally developed, there are some patterns that are out there. So I think some work remains to be done in thinking through that much more carefully than I've had the chance to. And so hopefully there's more to be written.
Great, thank you. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience, and we do have a microphone. I believe this is being recorded, I hope, so please do wait for the mic if you have a question. Any hands? Yes, right in the middle.
Is this work? Yes. I'm wondering, aside from the other sewers who quilted the tops of her panels, was her work sewn together exclusively by hand?
Sure. No, it was not. So she did use a machine, and actually I know, Sammy, you have some insights on on the machines that she used.
Yes, the majority of her work was done on the machine. I can't tell you how many sewing machines I took her to get. It's just unbelievable. Yeah. So the majority of her work was done on sewing machines. Yes.
But maybe just to add on to that too, there are several quilts that we received in the gift that had already been backed. So there is some information that we don't know about all the quilts in terms of their construction, which for some reason maybe in the future we might even venture to explore that question. But there are a handful. So for example, the last slide that I showed in my presentation, there is no backing, and you can see very clearly the approach of stitching, in which case that was a machine stitched top.
Okay, here. Oh, okay, you there in the back, and then here.
Okay. Mr. Howard, we get to see your mother's quilts displayed on a wall. We see the entirety of them. And I'm wondering, in her own life, in her own home, how did she see them? Did she put some out on beds, or did she get to see her quilts as fully as we do?
Yes, she did. They were stacked. They were stacked 6 feet high. Her and Eli were, I tell you, they were twins. They were identical. You go to Eli's house, same thing. You couldn't get in. So many quotes, so many this and that. She knew where everything was. Believe me, she knew where everything was. Don't touch that. So yeah, that was my mom.
Did she ever open them up and look at them after she was done?
Oh yeah. She sure did, and they would be, like the 3/6. All those would be in a pile and stacked, and then her latest work would be somewhere else. So she knew where everything was. Yes. Very organized.
Okay, I think we had a question right up here.
Just wondering about the quilting process itself. whether she was involved at all in that, because obviously there are certain choices that need to be made, in terms of the quilting, the stitching, and, what kind of yarn, or not yarn, but thread, and where to stitch, and, what the backing, and all that kind of stuff. I'm wondering if she was at all involved in at least some of that.
She did quilt some of them, and you can tell in the exhibition if there isn't a credit saying quilted by, then it was quilted by her if there's not a credit to another person. But they're relatively few and far between. And my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, Elaine, that she did not have any involvement with the quilting by other people. In fact, never, or probably never met the women who were doing the quilting. And it doesn't appear that she gave instructions that we know of. But Elaine?
Yeah, I'd say that's largely right. And thank you for your question, because it does then remind me sort of a question that we haven't been able to pursue more fully, is actually examining how some of the Tompkins chosen backs relate to the front. So a few examples come to mind. In the very first gallery, there's one quilt with the small yellow ties that sort of look like a field of flowers in a way. The back itself is also pieced, and we haven't had a chance to examine that one closely. Or there's one really gorgeous Christmas quilt on that wall. I believe it's on the far left. The front is turquoise and gold and with splashes of yellow, but you turn it on the back and it's purple satin. And so I think there are some very intentional choices in her selection, again, that we, should pursue more.
You, and then back to you, but for now.
Hello. Is this on?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So I actually had the pleasure of working with Eli when you did the show at the other Berkeley Art Museum. And he and the museum had hired me to do some textile ID for some of the quilts that are here. I have often wondered, and hearing now that your mother was so engaged with Girl Scouts and the flea market and all, what is that connection with her not really wanting to be in the forefront, for the exhibition of her quilts? I know she came to some of the shows kind of incognito, according to Eli. Do you think that came a little bit from Eli himself, or was that most of your mom wanting to stay private, when it came to show openings and her work?
Well, the main thing is she was a private person. I mean, that's, for whatever reason, I'm like that. I'm not secretive, but I'm private, and so I can't say she just was, she was her own person, and she did what she wanted to do when she wanted to do it. That's, that's kind of all of us, really, to be honest, but that's, yeah. Yeah, but this is different. This is later on. She, we were only 17 years apart. So she was younger, but, we're talking, she was, 29, 28, 30 maybe at the most. She's young. So as time went on, maybe she, just kind of got away from all that.
Sammy, you told a very touching story of one time when you did take her to an exhibition. You want to tell them how that went? When you drove her, I think it was here, yeah, and you drove her and she wouldn't get out of the car.
Yeah, that was in '97, I think. Yeah. So Eli, he begged her to come. Effie, come on, you got to see this. You could be very persuasive. And so we drove down here, and she didn't want to get out. Now we was gonna have to pull her out. But eventually we talked her into coming, and she saw it, and, she didn't think nothing of it. It didn't, fame, kind of nonchalant, kind of, she don't get excited very often. I'm the same way. Nothing bothers, and so she just didn't, for whatever reason, she didn't want to get out. But when she saw it, she was like, yeah, that's nice.
Okay, I think you had, in the back, and then, okay, yes, and then in the red in the back. Go ahead.
My stepmom and her mom did a lot of quilting at our house, and we've got a number of quilts, but they're traditional quilts. When they piece things, they'd sit in the chair, and they're squares, and they're traditional patterns. And I'm curious as to how she went around piecing these quilts, because they're very irregular. It's not the sort of thing you just sit in your lap and piece. And did she do this on a table, and was this all planned out, or was this sort of as it came to her?
Well, she had a sewing room. That's where everything was, and it was just stretched out, and she'd sew the little pieces together, and then she'd put that over, then she'd do another one, sew that one, put that one away. Yeah, everything, she knew where everything was. Everything, that was her room. That was her getaway spot right there.
And I believe Eli Leon does write about how she never really measured her pieces, that a lot of it was sort of done by eye. And then the way you're describing her workspace, Sammy, sort of accords with that. She just sort of had this free space to sort of piece and juxtapose things.
Absolutely.
But she was working within certain traditional idioms, the half square, the strings, the strips, the medallions. So the traditional modalities are there, but dealt with in a very unique and personal way, and with some degree of improvisation. In the back? Yes.
I'm just curious how she could amass all that fabric. Did you take her out to shop for it, or did she know where to buy it? Because some of us quilters have so much fabric, we really don't know what to do with it.
I did, actually. She would go to secondhand stores and get her fabric, and also Joann's fabric. And so, yeah, she knew where to get it. She'd go in and look for specific items. So she knew everything, what she needed for her projects.
And this is something that I think distinguishes her a little bit from some quilt makers, that she wasn't just reusing things that were around. She had something in mind, and she went out and bought it. Okay, here.
So I've got like 3 comment questions. I want to hear more about the morning ritual of peacemaking, sort of putting together this material as a way of releasing the spirit. And I want to hear more about, when I was walking through the exhibit, I just thought, I don't know these verses. I need to bring my Bible. I mean, it's like this stuff is hecka deep, and I'm like missing everything. And so I'm just wondering, what about the people that don't know the Bible and all those numbers, and then how they repeat? And so you know that these are some important verses. And then I wanted to ask you about seeing your family, the names and the years and the dates. It's like a memorial. Some of the quilts to family and to relationship. So those are my 3 questions.
Who wants to start? Lisa.
In the work I've been doing, it sounds like for people with experienced hands as quilters, that quilting can be something that both distracts you a little bit, maybe when the pain is too big, and then also lets you dwell in it when you actually want to go and have a memory and remember a loved one. So there's like some balance that seems to take place for experienced quilt makers that in terms of reading the oral histories and the testimony, that allows them to get close to the pain and then back away from it when it just gets too much. And so that's one of the things I've been thinking about with the quilt I'm looking at. there's also, incredible narratives with people saying, I needed to piece, like for cover, like I needed to piece to have a space. Maybe I'm super busy and there's no other space in my life. I've got kids, I got work, I got all this. There's no other space in my life but quilting where I can actually process my emotions, including the really hard ones. So those are the ways I'm seeing it come up in relation to grief and also into deepening feelings of love and longing too.
Thank you so much for those questions. And as I was thinking about how to answer, I was thinking about how the real incredible, I would just say, gorgeousness of the citation from a book, and having that citation be written on the heart, and so much so that in the mode of making, it becomes a meditative mantra, in a sense. And there's a sacred reading practice called Florilegia, where it's like, I'm going to take, John 23 and Psalms 46, and I'm going to recite them, together and see what's new, see what comes up. What really struck me, as you said, not religious, but spiritual, deeply well read in the Bible, that idea that in Seventh-day Adventism, the Bible is unerring, but in the reading and the meditation on the verses, we can wrestle with the divine. And so I see those moments of calling out specific verses as both a prayer, a mantra, and also a bit of wrestling. Where can I find my restive ease with this? And I find it so deeply beautiful to then think about a machine and having to draw that piece to make that J and to make that O and to make those H's, right? It's something that the hands, the body, the mind are all entwined. And so you think, oh my goodness, this person is a walking lexicon for these verses and these hymns, and that life of the Spirit is quite humbling.
Thank you. Sammy?
To answer your question on how did I feel when I first saw those? Is that the question? Well, when I first went in for the private showing, I was just overwhelmed. I could feel her spirit because I hadn't seen a lot of those in over 40 years. And especially there's one that has my birth year on it, 1953. And that one really got to me. That, it's really gratifying. It's magnificent. But I didn't know the significance of it then, because I was still trying to find my way in the world, you know what I mean? I knew she was talented, I knew she was gifted, but, I had my own family at that time, and so now to see this, it's just unbelievable, and my cousins, everybody's name is on it. She's very family-oriented, and our family is very tight growing up, very, very tight, and so, like I say, she's very spiritual. We went to church 5 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Bible study, Thursday, choir practice. I know a lot. I know all those scriptures. I'm not bragging or anything, but, the Bible, when you've been taught that from a young age, it's here, it's here. And I thank God every day. I really do. I thank him every day.
Thank you. Yes, right there.
I can talk loud enough, but I'd like to ask about her formative years and who she might have studied with, because personally, when I first started working, we in quilt making and learning it, there were lots of classes that were offered, and the use of certain tools pretty much prevented people from becoming improvisational quilters like her. So in that way, I think we're also lucky that she was born when she was born and had whatever influences. Her use of color seems super musical to me also. And so I just wondered if you remember her taking classes and who mentored her in quilting. Did her friends teach her to quilt, or did she discover it all on her own?
No, it was inherited from her mother, Sadie. Yeah, I think it's just something that God put in her, you know. And if you've seen when Elaine was doing her thing up there, that her mother's quilt and my mother's quilt looked almost identical. So that's something you don't teach that. Either you have it or you don't. And I just think that she was just naturally gifted to do that, you know.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. Oh, yes, right in the back, right in the middle there.
I'd like to make a mention. I believe you're from Arkansas, right?
That's correct.
Say that loud and proud. Say it loud and proud. And I'm a guest from Maxine McCullough from
Maxine.
Gould, Arkansas.
Gould,
and
Arkansas.
I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. So I just thought maybe it might be some other Arkansans around. But it's very important. And Sister Maxine is her sister and Sammy's aunt. So, you know, the history is so important. And Sister Maxine, we are from the same church, Grace Baptist Church. There she is, waving her hand. But I just want, and I know I wanted to mention Arkansas, Gould, Arkansas. Amen.
Thank you, thank you. Sammy, do you want to introduce the members of your family who are here?
Yes, I'd like to thank my family and friends for coming. That's my niece, Alicia, my niece, Lisa, Maxine McCullough. Those are my mom's sister and her grandchildren and great-grand.
Great, well, thanks everyone for coming, and let's go enjoy some quilts.